But the reason I'm here today is this man, Walter Traill Dennison, a remarkable person, and for the folklore and heritage of Orkney, they really don't come much more important than Walter, because without him, the stories that we have, the folk tales that we have, would be a lot sparser. But rather than just speaking about him, you really need to speak about his family, where they came from, where they fitted in to life in Orkney. The family tradition goes, oh, still need more. I was never expecting as many folk. I always think nobody's going to turn up, so I'm very, not only relieved, but highly delighted. Right, Walter Traill Dennison's family, according to family tradition. Now, family tradition can mean all sorts of things. I mean, I'm supposed to be descended from a North African Moor who was lost on a Spanish Armada ship on Start Point, according to the family legend. Although there's no Armada ship on Start Point, and and all the DNA kind of suggests that I'm probably not North African. So, I mean, family legends aren't necessarily strictly accurate. But then again, they can be. We don't know. So, according to the Dennisons, according to the family tradition, the Dennisons in Orkney came from a place called Coole in Forfarshire, and they came up to Orkney in the late 16th century in the entourage of Earl Robert Stewart, who was the illegitimate son of King James V of Scotland and half-brother of Mary Queen of Scots, who he was quite pally with, so she gave him Orkney and Shetland to play with, get him up the road. But the family leased the land at Washiter, here in Sanday, and it's a big firm. It had belonged to the Sinklers, and that was connected with the earldom land. So when Robert Stewart got the Earldom Orkney, he got the former earldom lands as well that belonged to the Sinklers. So they moved there. The first one was a guy called Jerome Dennison, who was always locally known as Charm. The name Jerome was always turned into Charm here. And so he was the first to live there. And the eldest sons in the family were always called Jerome. That was the tradition in the family. So that goes back to the late 1600s. They're in Washington. Now, Walter's father and his great-grandfather and his grandfather were at Notland Castle. So his great-grandfather, who was John Dennison, was married to the Janet Fay, whose brother was the laird in Carrickhouse and Eddy. And at the time that he was the laird there in Carrickhouse, they had a visitor, a fellow called John Gow, who was a pirate, who had employed a young Western man called Pottinger to be a pilot, taking around the North Isles. They had no idea, well, he had no idea that they were pirates when he signed on to the ship. But his son found out what they were. And it was him that deliberately steered the vessel into the tides to put it ashore on the Caffa Eddy. So it was deliberately done on the fly, because obviously if Gow found out, he would have shot him. So that's why they were stranded there. And it seems some of the other pirates had abandoned the ship and stolen the ship's boat. They couldn't get an anchor out to drop it and pull himself off the rocks. So he was stuck. He needed a boat. And there was a long negotiation going with the Fays at Carrick, James Fay, to lend them a boat so that he could tuck a cage anchor out, drop it, pull himself off the rocks. He knew fine that the reason he was there was because he was actually coming to raid his house. So there was they were at school together, but obviously didn't get on. And he just thought it would be a lot easier to go around and raid all his laird's houses that were always by the shore. They were near the sea, so they were easy to attack. And at the capture of Gow, there was John Dennison and his son Jerome, who was Walter's great-grandfather and grandfather. So that's 1725. Gow gets captured, and they are, of course, still living in Notland Castle. Lovely view of our view of the kitchen. Now, he ran a navigation school there, Jerome Dennison, Walter's granddad, and his father, James Dennison, was born at Notland Castle. And he ran a navigation school there for sailors. And he always said that the best ones among them were the lads that were said to be descended from the Dons, the Spanish Armada survivors on Westray. Again, no evidence for this, but the story certainly was very strong that there was the Dons in Westray, and that the guys that were the best at learning navigation were families of the Dons. So they lived there anyway until his grandfather's death, Jerome, and then they moved for a short time to Stove, where they had family relatives. There was an aunt there that they lived at. But he also had another adventure there, because during the time that he lived there, this is a Drown Gentleman's Ha, sea cave in Westray. And this is where some of the lairds hid out when they were on the run from the government troops after the 1745 rebellion. They were Jacobites. And among them was Patrick Fay, who lived at Stove as well. And they were supplied with food by James Dennison. So it's Jerome Dennison, Walter's granddad. He had a servant lass called Peggy Dennison, who may have been a relation, don't know. But she gave down with a leather bag that they put food in, and lowered it on a rope down to the cave where the lairds were hiding. And they hid out there anyway. Word got to the man that was leading the search for them in Orkney was a guy called Benjamin Moody from Melsetter. And he got wind that the Dennisons were helping these lairds in hiding. So one night, during the night, they raided the castle, dragged them out of bed and interrogated him to try to find out where the lairds were hiding. And he denied any knowledge of it, and so they got nothing out of him. But they said that in retaliation they pulled the roof off Notland Castle. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what the family story said. And this is a drawing by Bryce Wilson of the interior of the Gentleman's Ha. Now, having lived at Stove for a while, James Dennison, who was Walter's dad, took the lease at North Mire, and He was married 4 times. The last marriage was to Helen Traill of Weststone, and they had 6 children. They had a daughter, Helen, and they had 5 sons, the youngest of whom was Walter Traill Dennison, and he was born at North Mire and brought up there. But towards the end of his father's life, he built a new house for the family, and it is here. West Brom was built sometime around 1850, and it was a fine big farm. It was 320 acres, which was a lot in those days for a sizable farm. When you think that crofts could be 15 acres, 20 acres, you know, not very big. So having a 320 acre farm was quite a big deal in those days. Now, Walter had lost 2 brothers. In fact, he lost his mother, and 2 brothers died of tuberculosis, and his father all died between sort of 1840 and 1850. One of his brothers had been studying medicine at Edinburgh University, and his books was passed on to his elder brother, Jerome, who then studied medicine, and he acted as a doctor in the island for anybody that needed help. They would go to see him, and he would hopefully prescribe a cure or find out what was wrong with them. He was also a lay preacher, and he did a bit, and he was a school teacher as well. So he kind of had a bit of quite a big pivotal role in the island. But in the 1851 census, we find that Walter was living here with his eldest sister Helen, his elder brother Jerome, and another brother called John, who was to die quite young as well. They had 2 servants, and they would have had farm servants as well that would have lived on the estate and worked it. It was famous for being a progressive farm. He introduced white oats instead of black oats, so it was shorter grain, shorter straw, but it had a higher yield of grain. He also grew tatties and neeps, which doesn't sound a big deal, but growing turnips in the mid-19th century was unusual, but a good source of food for the cattle, but also grand for clapshot as well. So you need a bit of neeps. And this was where Walter spent, well, that's where he lived when he was a young man. He married in 1870 a woman. This is not his wife, by the way, this is his daughter. But he married in 1870 to Elizabeth Robertson, who had come from Kirkwall. Her father was a customs and excise officer in Kirkwall. He was also an owner of Highland Park Distillery as well later. They had 1 child, Jane Chessie, here, who was born in 1876 at the West Brom, and she married the Reverend Duncan McLaren, who was Frieskirk minister for Finstone, for Firth. So they're buried in the kirkyard in Finstone. Now, Dennison was a very religious man, and there was the Sanday revival, you may have heard of, 1860. There was a big evangelical drive that swept the island And there were stories about folk refusing to leave the kirk. They wanted the sermon to keep going. And so there was kind of mass hysteria was reported in the local papers. Now, the Free Kirk minister in Cross-and-Burness at the time was the Reverend Matthew Armour. And Armour, his style of preaching was unconventional, I think, to kind of say the least. I mind asking my father's cousin, David Toury at Clickham, what was it about his preaching that folk didn't like? Oh, he says, he was just kind of a droll man, and he would be whispering out to him one minute and crouching down in the pulpit, and the next minute he'll be leaping up and flechtering like a bird, he was and yelling out to him. And this did not go down well with the Dennisons. And they built a breakaway kirk. And remember, the Free Kirk was already a breakaway kirk from the established church. But they had a breakaway from the breakaway. And built this one, this Free Kirk Station kirk. And it was just known locally as Dennison's Kirk. And Walter and Jerome both preached there. And every year he would write a Christmas hymn. Walter would write a Christmas hymn to be sung in the kirk. And the Orkney Herald would publish it in the first week of January. So these things were always being published. In 1861, we see the first steps by Walter Traill Dennison into writing, where he produced a book of hymns. And that was published anonymously. So, but the hymn book was brought out, and again, I mean, his faith was incredibly strong, and we have a slightly more up-to-date picture of it. But Revival Hymns was the name of the book, which you might have noticed I was struggling to remember.
Is this on Sunday, isn't it? Is that on Sunday?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a garage, no? So that's it, as it was. That was it in 1994, which is an important year, but we'll get on to that later. So they had a congregation of about 120 folk, and they said that they would pass the Free Kirk folk going the other way as they were heading off to the kirk on a Sunday, and neither ones would speak to the other. But they would speak to them quite happily during the week. But on a Sunday on the way to kirk, it was like, no speaking to them. But his big collection came out in 1880, the Arcadian Sketchbook. Now, he had another small book published in 1872 under the pen name of Skramer. Can never figure out what that was. It's got something to do with Nordic mythology, but I looked it up and I can't find it, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. But he had published 2 poems in that one, the Lives and Loves of Lady Sarah and Petty Torrell's Trevelya. Now, the Life and Love of Lady Sarah is about a woman who runs away with her lover to sea and is tricked by Scott Abess, a witch that lived on Stronsay, who conjured up a phantom ship that they followed, and they get on the shores at Burness and are buried at the Nausea Yarrow. So that's around near Arion in Burness. But Petty Torrell's Trevelya was important. 1872, that was the first time that Orkney dialect had been written down and published. The whole poem is what they call a Hear Mead rhyme. So it was a well-known story in song about a guy who fancied a lass, but her parents didn't think much of him. So he climbed on the roof and he was looking down through the smoke hole to see if her parents were going to go to bed so that he could sneak in and see her. But he got a teeny bit too far forward, fell through the hole in the roof, landed on the fire, was hid in an iron pot. The water in the pot, hopefully no boiling, put the fire out, so there was just ash and steam and smoke everywhere. And then this figure appears with a big round head with the two horns, which was the feet of the pot. And of course the parents were horrified and all, and for obvious reasons. But Trevelya is a word that is not used anymore. I use it sometimes because I just like the word, but it just means a violent fall. If you're up a step ladder and you fall off it, you come to a Trevelya. It's not to be recommended. But with the Arcadian sketchbook, he started to gather together the stories that he had heard as a bairn and as a young man in Sanday. He was fascinated with old stories. And what you have in the sketchbook is usually it's stories of people. There is domestic disputes. There's a mean woman who swore a lot. There is why the house of Helsness was burnt. So it was again about the Jacobites being, they were Jacobite lairds being attacked by the Hanoverian troops after the 45 rebellion and having the house burnt. And there is a folk traditions of that, but then there is also a kind of comic element as well, where they let the bull out to chase the troops. And so there's all sorts of, but half of the book is actually poetry. And some of the poems were based on actual events that he had heard of, stories that he had turned into poems. Some were like Petty Torrell's Trevelya and the 12 Break Brothers, was stories that, humorous stories that were told as rhymes, as songs, ballads. So he gathered together all of these things, and it's a tremendous book. It's difficult to read if you're no Arcadian and you weren't born in the 1700s, because it's a dialect that he heard as a bairn. So the dialect is 18th century, and it is very, very broad. So you really you can struggle a bit with it, even flipping back to the glossary, because he had a glossary of words in the back. Again, the first time that Orkney words had ever been put together in some kind of a glossary or some kind of not exactly a dictionary, but just the collection of words and their meanings. If I could have a wish, oh hell, I'd have a lot, to be honest. But one of them, pretty near the top, would be to sit at that fire, because that was the fire in West Broch. To sit on that side of the fire with Walter on the other side and just say, tell us a story, boy, and see what he came out with. Because he had been gathering folk tales, not just about people and events, but about Selkie folk, mermaids, Finn folk. All of these things he had been gathering since he was young. And fortunately for us, towards the end of his life, he was asked to contribute these stories to a journal called the Scottish Antiquary. So between 1891 and 1893, there was a whole series of these stories were released in little essays, which would incorporate several stories. And they were republished in '95 in this book here, which I was involved with a lot in a previous life. And they are the finest folk tales in Orkney. Simple as that. There were stories gathered by other people in other places, not as many, and also know the richness of these stories, which were incredibly detailed and magical, and some of them quite long. And we'll have a very quick skim over them. At Westbrook, he had a scrapbook, and folk that visited could write something in it. He wrote poetry in it as well, some of the poems that ended up in the Arcadian sketchbook. And other people did drawings, and there was cartoons that were taken from like Punch and all that, and glued into it. And this is a lovely little story here. It says, an after dinner scene suggested by one of W.T. W.T.D's stories. It's dated 1882, so that's 2 years after the sketchbook came out. And it's a story called the Hild Horn Rumpus. Now, Hild was the old word for midnight. And when folk visited friends' houses, they could get woken up at midnight with a horn of strong ale, a drinking horn of strong ale. And so you would drink that, thank them, and away you'd go. And it was during one of these late night drinking sessions that at Akernis, that something gave by the window, which they weren't sure what it was, turned out to be the minister fleeing to save his chastity, because the mistress of the house, who was also the mother of Benjamin Moody, who was going around burning the laird's houses at the time, was trying to get off with this minister. Her husband had been shot on Broad Street in 1725, and she was, shall we say, lonely. And so she fancied the minister. The minister wasn't having it. She went to his bed with the hild horn and made some suggestions that made him jump out the window and run. But the one guy in this is a fella called Villian, who is the hero of the story. And he was recalling a time that he was drinking with his pals late one night, and they were all starting to fall off the chairs, you see, on the floor there. There's a couple of victims in here already. He's on the way out. So it ends up that Villian is the only one that is left sitting at the table. And he hears a noise under the table. He looks under it, and he sees the devil, who is busy strangling one of his pals. And so he gives him a face full of insults, and the devil gets up, and he's, not too happy. He offers him a drink, so the devil takes a drink, but leaves sooty finger marks on the drinking vessel, which Villian says that he's an ill-mannered type for coming to a table with dirty hands. And so the two of them start to argue. But the devil knows that Villian has got a couple of pages of a psalm book sewn into the lining of his waistcoat. And as long as he's got that on him, he can't do him any harm. So he keeps threatening, challenging him to fight, saying, take your waistcoat off and we'll have this out, knowing that he would then have no power. And he makes a reference to his pals being dead. And he said, no, they're just dead drunk. And he says, no, they're dead all right. And claps his hands. And the ghosts of his pals appear behind him. And then Villian says, will any fool can ding the soul into a drunk buddy, but I'd like to see you trying to put a soul back into him again. So the devil says, oh, no bother, and he grabs the one body, grabs a soul, and he shoves it into the body, and the fella comes back alive again. And meanwhile, Velian is unpicking the seams of his waistcoat to get out the pages for the psalm book, to put in a keg of gin to throw at the devil's head. And the devil is having problems because he's trying to put Craigie's soul back into Scarth's body, and it's the wrong one, and it won't fit. So he has to end up getting the right soul in the right body. And then once he's done that, and all his pals are alive again, he says, "Tak this for your pay," and he throws a keg of gin at the devil's head, and it's got the psalm book pages in it, and of course the devil is sent flying and disappears up the lump in a blue low, cursing after him in broad Orkney dialect, because before that he spoke very proper. And then suddenly he's going, "By my faith, Valiant, if I get me hands on you, boy." So a lesson about devils. So that appears in the West Brook scrapbook, and this is an illustration again of Bryce Wilson's of the Armada stories. One of the Armada boats was wrecked off Fair Isle, El Gran Griffin. It's been explored, we know it definitely exists. And a lot of these Spanish sailors were left on the island, on Fair Isle, and they didn't have enough food to feed them, and there was no way of getting them off, because it was stormy weather. So every time they'd found a Spaniard kind of near a cliff, you know, and nobody about, he got shoved over. And they managed to pull the top out of a roof, the tree, as they called it, that supported all the slates. They pulled that out and the flagstones fell on them and killed them. My ancestors are complicit in that as well, because my great granny on my mother's side came from Fair Isle. So. Now, this is one of the stories that appear in the Arcadian sketchbook as well, the Stolen Winding Sheet, the Stolen Shroud, where Baba Skilua has this beautiful shroud that she's going to be buried in, stolen by a woman that goes by the name of Black Chalk. She was named after her dad, whose nickname was Black Chalk. And she dabbled in the black arts, and she dug up poor old Baba Skilua's body and stole this beautiful shroud, because she said it was too good to waste being buried in. And then one night, this guy Andrew Moody is going past the kirkyard at Cross, and there is pillars of light coming to all the graves with ghosts standing on top of them, and there's one on some, two on others, 3, 4, 5 on others. It's all the people that are buried in the grave, and they're all punting and talking away about this one old woman who's standing there naked, trying to cover herself. And they pursue him down to Black Chalk's house, where they besiege it until she gets her stolen winding sheet back. But it's quite the story. So that's Baba's ghost coming through there. The Stoorworm, Stoororm in Old Norse, meaning great serpent. He told the story of Asiepartel and Stoorworm. Tantalizingly, he says that there was lots of Asiepartel stories in Orkney. There was different stories where he was the hero, but he never records any. This is the only one that we know. And Asiepartel is the ne'er-do-well who lies by the side of the fire, covered in ashes. And Walter Traill Dennison was known as Asiepartel when he was a bear, and his brothers used to call him Asiepartel because he was the youngest, and he was a dreamer, and I loved stories. So Asiepartel sails down the monster's throat and sets fire to its liver, and it dies. Its tongue forms the Baltic Sea, the hole that it makes. Its teeth makes Orkney, Shetland, Faroes, and then it curls up and dies. and remains there as Iceland. And the burning liver is what causes the volcanoes and the boiling water gushing out the ground. How the Finn folk lost Einhallow. Again, this was among his folklore collection in Scottish Antiquary. A man whose wife is stolen by a Finn man swears his revenge and is able to have the power to see part of Helgeland, one of their floating magical islands, and he sets off there with his sons, having seen off some phantom whales, and then there's a monster on the beach, but he throws salt at it, and it's the Finn man that's stolen his wife, who he vanquishes and then gets his sons, 3 sons, to sow 3 rings of salt all the way around the island, and he cuts 9 crosses in the turf to fix it. So that's why Einhallow becomes part of Orkney. But the youngest son had big hands and didn't finish the last ring, so he ran out of salt, and so they say that it's still got a magic quality about it. A Helgeland story of a young woman called Annie Norn, who comes to the rescue of her cousin and takes him to Helgeland to safety. Tam Scott has a boat that he takes down for Sanday to go to Kirkwall at the Lammas Fair time, and he gets hired by a man with black hair, black moustache and beard, who wants to take a coup to one of the North Isles, and he agrees, and the guy comes down leading the coup, and then he just picks it up and sets it in the boat. So he thinks, don't argue with this guy. And then they're heading off, and he says, where do you want to go? And he says, east of Shaughnessy. So they go east of Shaughnessy, and they come to Stronsay. He goes, do you want in here? No, east of Stronsay. So they go to the east of Stronsay, and then he says, right, if you want to go to Sanday, and he said, east of Sanday. And he says, there's nothing east of Sanday but Norway. And this boat can't survive a trip over the North Sea. But he insists, and they come into a bank of fog, and he blindfolds them, and then they land on a beach, and he's in Helgeland, with mermaids singing on the shore, and he gets paid for it. But the next year he sees the same man at the Lammas Fair, and he says, oh, who have you been since I seen you last? It's good to see you again. And he says rather ominously, did you ever see me? You'll never need to say that again. And he takes out what he thinks is a snuff box and blows the contents of it into Tam's eyes, and he goes blind from that moment on. Don't trust Finn folk is the moral of the story. Arthur Dernis gets abducted from Hammernes, which is an old name for a part of the shore at West Broch, at the Ness Broch. And he gets carried off by a beautiful mermaid to Helgeland, to Finn folk again, the home under the waves. I just must read you this short extract that Dennison wrote about mermaid stories and how he heard them. I've seen an old withered woman with grey hair and wizened face, her head in a sooty cap, a sooty square of homespun over her shoulders, a torn dirty petticoat of homespun over her knees, her left foot stretched before her on the hearthstone, that foot in a stocking through which the big toe protruded, her naked right foot stretched over her left, while she was busy darning the stocking she had pulled off for that purpose, while in the mists of her poverty and squalor she was painting in the most glowing colours to a group of youngsters the unequalled charms of the mermaid. The old woman seemed wholly absorbed by the beauty of the being she described. Her hands dropped on her knees, her eyes glowed with the enthusiasm imparted by her description, and from the manner in which she emphasized her laudatory words, you could not for a moment but believe that she had seen with her own eyes the charming creature she described, while we youngsters, with eyes wide open and gaping mouths, sat around her spellbound, believing every word she said. So it's important to remember that these folk tales were more than just folk tales to people at this time. They were stories, they were entertainment and stuff, sure, but they also believed in them. Mermaids were real, and Finn folk were real. And so was the Nuckleby that haunted the shore, a hideous creature, part man, part horse, with no skin on his body. And he would destroy the whole islands if it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't stand fresh water. So he wasn't able to come and wreck the place. And in the summer months, he was kept locked up by the mother of the sea, the spirit that guided the sea and gave life to all the creatures in it. So that stopped him from destroying the whole of Orkney. And of course, the Selkie woman. Story from North Ronaldsay about a man that steals a Selkie woman's skin, and she gets it back when her youngest child betrays the hiding place. The Tale of the Lady Audevere was a long poem that was one of these here-made rhymes. It was a ballad that he records, working with a woman called Mrs. Hiddleston, and she had gathered a lot of it as well. She owned a lot of land in Orford and is buried in Orford. But it's about a woman who is forced to marry a man named Lord Audevere, who has sworn the oath to Odin that he will have her as his wife. But she had a Selkie lover before, who comes back to her when her husband is away on a crusade, and she becomes pregnant to him, and then he comes back for the child. It's similar to this great Selkie Asulskeri song as well. He pays her for the nurse's fee, and she puts a gold ring around, a gold chain around her baby Selkie's neck, and it turns out when her husband comes back, he goes hunting otters, and of course he kills a seal. And it's a small one with dark head and sooty paws and a gold chain around its neck. And he recognises the chain as being the one that he gave to his wife, Lady Audevere, on their wedding. So it's all gone pretty bad for her, but there's a happy ending, you'll be glad to hear. She gets rescued by the Selkie, and he gets left sitting with no company because nobody will drink with him or do anything with him. Now, without Walter, these stories would not be known. And he has been a big part of my life as well, as we will come on to, which is completely would have come as a shock to him, as much as it came as a shock to me. But this is a lovely drawing from the West Broch scrapbook. You can see West Broch there with giant white martacks, and in the corner there, this is like Christmas time. They're playing a piano and singing along, so you've got a bit of musical accompaniment. And it's signed there, souvenir, West Broch, a souvenir of the 2nd of January 1894. Now, Walter had been born on the 6th of October 1825. And 1894 was the year that he died. He died on the 2nd of September that year. So this drawing was done in the last year of his life. So, it's 1993. I've been working at the museum for 5 years. I'm still working at the bloody museum. And in comes this guy, who I've never seen before in my life. And he says, do you have a painting of Walter Traill Dennison? No, I said, we don't have any paintings of him. We've got a photograph, but we don't have a painting. And he said, oh, well, he was my great-grandfather. And I said, well, we were actually thinking of doing an exhibition about him next year for the centenary of his death. And he said, would you like to borrow some of his artifacts? And I went, you know, are you kidding? You know, it's one of those moments where there was this beam of light came and the Hallelujah chorus played, and it was just like unreal. But sure enough, true to his word, we borrowed some pieces from him. Here he is holding a pipe that belonged to Walter that is made out of wood from the Spanish Armada ship. More about that later. I was younger in those days, so that was me and Bride, so I had dragged out of retirement to do the illustrations for the exhibition, and they ended up in this book. And we ended up doing the book Mermaid Bride together as well, right in the back of that, but you know, took a few years to do, which is 25 years old now. So this is me again. In this building, we set up the exhibition here first. We felt it was important that Sanday should be the first place to have the exhibition, not Kirkwall. He was a Sanday man, and that's that. So I got the job of writing the exhibition. I'd never written anything in my bloody life before, and I'm dyslexic, so I used to avoid writing things as much as possible. But he said, well, you're interested in folklore and your feather comes for Sanday, so you're doing it. So you can't argue with facts like that. This photograph here, I can't find. I've been trying to, but that is Walter Traill Dennison and his wife. It's a wedding photograph. Back in the days when wedding photographs had the men sitting down comfortably and the women standing alongside them. It's probably what the song Stand By Your Man comes from. Oh, bad puns, guys. But on the 2nd of September 1994, the exhibition opened. There was a concert that evening with readings by local people, and there was music, and it was a great time. And the next day there was a kirk service with readings from Duncan McLaren, his great-grandson, and you can just mark him at the back there, Malcolm Dennison, who was the Lord Lieutenant for Orkney at the time, and a distant relation. So this was at Westbrook with Duncan McLaren there, his wife Chenny there, that's David and Marianne of Westbrook, Tory, and David and Willie Tory, click him in. So it was lovely, and me in a suit. Jeez, you never see that. Or I try to avoid it as much as possible. And we did a tour. That was some members of the Heritage Society who had come out for it as well. And we did a tour around the island and ended up at the kirkyard at Cross, where there was flowers put in the grave by the McLaren family. And as you can see, it's been beautifully restored. Haven't seen it yet. Will try to get out there this weekend, because it's wonderful that this work has been done. I was contacted about it, saying that I know the having contact with the family, which I did, because we've been sending Christmas cards to each other for 30 years. And so I said, you know, they were interested in restoring it, but they needed permission from the family. And his first response is, well, we need to put some money into that as well. The kirkyard at Cross, where there was flowers put in the grave by the McLaren family. And as you can see, it's been beautifully restored. Haven't seen it yet. Will try to get out there this weekend, because it's wonderful that this work has been done. I was contacted about it, saying that I know the having contact with the family, which I did because we've been sending Christmas cards to each other for 30 years. And so I said, you know, they were interested in restoring it, but they needed permission from the family. And his first response is, well, we need to put some money into that as well. So they were really, really keen and very supportive. And then not this past Christmas, the Christmas before, I got the usual Christmas card from Duncan McLaren. And in it there was a letter saying, we've been thinking about what to do with Walter Traill Dennison's artefacts, and we would like him to come back to Orkney, so we want to donate them to Orkney Museum. So I did a pretty happy dance and went and seen Ellen Pessy there, who is the curator of social history. She's actually a Bakey Festinus, but married to a Frenchman with an Italian surname. So that's a pocket watch belonging to the family. And among the things that came back, this is Walter's collection of artifacts in his private museum. Whenever there was any archaeological discoveries made, he was always called in, and he had pots, urns from Bronze Age kists. He had lots of flints, and there was a few Viking graves as well, so he would have swords and axes, and they would always keep the skulls, but nothing else. It was that time where skulls was kind of cool. And it also followed that sort of notion at the time about intelligence and the size of your skull. There was a lot of skull measuring going on in this sort of pseudo-science in the 19th century. And into the 20th century, the Nazis were very big on it. I think that says it all. But this is his collection, including things that were historical pieces as well. So